Back to one of our
Thanks,
top
Bill.
stories right now. 4 battleground states have now responded to a lawsuit filed by Texas trying to overturn their election results. So what should we expect from the U.S. Supreme Court? I want to bring in Fox News contributor George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley. Nice to see you, Professor. Good day to you. I have seen some clips. They call it bogus claims on behalf of Texas. They say this is a chance of this happening could be 1 in a quadrillion. What do you think the U.S. Supreme Court does now that this has been responded to?
Well, it's highly unlikely to be successful. The problem is that Texas is carrying more baggage on this one than Amtrak. I mean, you've got a lot of problems that the court is going to be concerned about. First, many of the courts previously have rejected these challenges under what's called latches, or the timing. They've said, why are you raising this now? Why didn't you come to court before the election? We're just before the Electoral College votes. You want us to negate the certification of a past election. We don't understand why you waited. Second, the Supreme Court defers to state courts and state Supreme Courts on their own laws, and they have rejected these claims, and they don't look kindly on one state trying to effectively enforce the laws of another state. But the biggest problem is that sticker shock problem, the relief. They're asking to effectively negate the certification, and with it, the results of the election in the view of many. The justices are probably not inclined to do that. So we saw with the Pennsylvania case, it was rejected 40 minutes after the last brief was filed without any dissent. In order for this to prevail, you need not 4, but 5 justices. Now, assuming that Chief Justice Roberts is not going to want anything to do with this, then you've got to get all 5 conservatives to sign on. And that's a very heavy burden.
And the clock's running right now. The state, Texas and the other 17, are challenging the results. And
just so you're aware, this is Jonathan Turley, who is the Republican Party's sole constitutional law scholar to be called as a witness during Trump's impeachment trial, where he claimed that Donald Trump shouldn't be impeached in a trial for having extorted a foreign country for dirt on his political opponent and then obstructing Congress's investigation into that very issue. And yet even that guy is showing up on Fox News to explain just how baseless this latest stunt by Trump and the Republican Party is. That's when you know you might have just put the cart before the horse. The issue at hand here is the latest doomed legal effort to overturn the election because Republicans aren't happy with the fact that Trump lost, and instead of accepting reality, they're hoping to just overturn the results by fiat. In this case, the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton sued to block electors from Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Georgia from being awarded to Joe Biden, which would put him below the 270 vote threshold to win the Electoral College. The rationale is that millions of ballots should be invalidated because there was widespread fraud, despite the fact that there's not actually been any evidence of widespread fraud. But that hasn't stopped Trump, along with 17 other Republican-led states, from joining the lawsuit. Because why bother waiting for proof of fraud when you can just arbitrarily decide it exists and then scream about it on TV? Now, a number of things would have to happen here for Republicans to succeed, each more unlikely than the last. The court would have to allow Paxton to file the suit. It would then have to have found proof of massive illegal voting and block certification of the Electoral College. The states could then resubmit their numbers, which would be the same because, lest you forget, there was no fraud. Or, as Trump's filing suggests, it would let state legislatures determine who wins each state, or throw the entire election to the U.S. House of Representatives, where each state delegation would have 1 vote, and Republican delegations outnumber Democratic delegations, so Trump would then win. But with all of that said, it's not going to happen. First of all, there is zero precedent for any of this. Republicans like to wail about quote-unquote activist judges on the left, but what they are asking the court to do is judicial activism to a degree never before seen in the history of this country, to unilaterally overturn an entire presidential election. In other words, legitimate rulings in favor of Democrats are always judicial activism that should be condemned, but appealing to conservative judges to completely and unilaterally undermine the will of 81 million American voters and decide the next president themselves totally checks out. Consider too that the Supreme Court has so far shown zero desire to cave to Trump and Republicans' demands and intervene in the election. Earlier this week, Pennsylvania Republicans asked the Supreme Court to invalidate the state's presidential tallies. The court responded by almost immediately rejecting Republicans' plea, issuing a single sentence saying, quote, "The application for injunctive relief presented to Justice Alito and by him referred to the court is denied." And there wasn't a single justice who publicly dissented. Not Kavanaugh, not Gorsuch, not Amy Coney Barrett. And by the way, for all of the states humoring Trump's temper tantrum and joining the lawsuit, there are even more that have urged the Supreme Court to reject it. 20 states, 2 territories, and Washington, D.C. filed an amicus brief explaining that the Republicans' case, quote, would upend a century's worth of this court's precedent, render unconstitutional routine and critical election administration, and supplant states' sovereign power to structure their own systems of government. Indeed, by demanding this court police state interpretation of state law, Texas's theory of the Electors Clause would reorder the Constitution and undermine our federalist system. And look, all this is, underneath the legalese, is a temper tantrum. That's it. It's Donald Trump being too thin-skinned to admit he lost, and lost to a person who he branded as the weakest candidate of the century. And so instead, he'd rather cry foul and pretend there was fraud than acknowledge reality. And the rest of these Republicans are showing that they are too collectively cowardly to stand up to a guy who's so toxic that he lost by the biggest margin of any incumbent since FDR. That's who they're debasing themselves for. That's who they're committing likely the most seditious act in the history of this country for. A failed, one-term president who oversaw the 4th biggest mass casualty event in American history before being voted out of office by the largest raw number of Americans we've ever seen in a presidential election. Pretty much puts into perspective how pathetic the Republican Party is when put into those terms, doesn't it? But the issue here really isn't the Texas case in and of itself, because the case is going to fail if the Supreme Court even touches it in the first place. The issue is that Republicans, who know better, are actually humoring this charade. They know Trump lost. They know there's no fraud. They know this entire disinformation campaign is nothing but a way for Trump to get his supporters to pay down his debt or for him to try and protect his damaged ego. And yet still these elected officials are trying to use our judicial system to perpetuate these lies to undermine the most important tenet of our democracy, our free and fair elections. And frankly, I don't know how we come back from that. I don't know how we continue to have a functioning democracy if one party doesn't agree with the basic elements of that democracy. What's needed now is for Republican leaders to grow a spine, stand up, and speak out against their party that has gone so far off the rails, it doesn't even resemble a democracy anymore. It's not Democrats speaking out that are going to change anything. It's not independents speaking out. It's Republicans who need to get a handle on their colleagues before they destroy the American experiment once and for all because they can't handle the fact that their reality TV host of a president lost the last election. If you like this video, please check out my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, where I take a deep dive into the week's most important stories and interview major players in politics, including Kamala Harris, Katie Porter, Adam Schiff, Nancy Pelosi, Eric Swalwell, Mary Trump, Al Franken, Cory Booker, and many, many more. Again, that's No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, available anywhere you listen to podcasts.